Hey everyone. In episode 99 of The Fog on the Whirlwind, I live streamed and there was a tech issue, so I wanted to record again. In this episode, I will be talking about the ICC issuing a warrant for the arrest of Benjamin Netanyahu. I will also be talking about a couple of other things. We'll be talking about some economic issues, as I promised I would for this year. I'll be talking about that and the Republican Party and the history the Republican Party has with doing that. The other thing that I wanted to talk to you guys about was the trend that I see with some young people, especially young men, who are leaving Protestantism and what I think about that. So I will be talking about that. I think it's important. And so as I talk about that, I wanted to remind you guys that it's important to subscribe if you haven't already. And we're going to begin our episode as we always do with our passage of the week. Our passage of the week is in Matthew 5, verses 43 through 44. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you." So it's important to remember that love, the definition of love that we have as Christians, is not the love of the world. So, for example, just because I'm commanded, and I want to take this very seriously by the Lord, to love my enemies, does not mean I just let them do whatever they want. Does not mean that I let them hold political power over me. Does not mean that I say, well, if the government or the left, progressives, want my children indoctrinated to hate me and hate God, that in the spirit of love, I just have to let them do whatever they want. That is not the definition of love that Christ is talking about. What he is talking about is in your day to day life to love. If you are, for example, you got to think who he was speaking to. He was speaking to an oppressed people under the boot of a government. In your day to day interaction with each other and also with the Samaritans, we can see with the Samaritans from Christ's own example, he treated them lovingly. Now, who was he also loving to? He was also loving to the Pharisees. He told them the truth and he spoke the truth about them. And that's an important thing worth remembering. Because even when he pronounced the seven woes upon the Pharisees, the hypocrites, he did so in a way that was loving because he spoke the truth and he did it correctly and properly. And it is possible for us to speak the truth boldly and powerfully and strongly, but to do so still in a loving way. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind. So the world's definition is, well, love means you just do whatever you're told. That's not what Jesus did. Jesus was a rebel against the state. Really, they were, that's not the right way to put it. Really, the state, the Romans, were rebelling against Christ's authority, the Pharisees too. And so, in the eyes of the government, though, he was a revolutionary or like a reactionary, when in truth, he was here to establish order, to create something, to renew the church, to correct the record. You see this when he's talking about he was teaching on the law, but not as the scribes and Pharisees. He was saying, okay, so this way that you, the Sanhedrin, have interpreted the law is wrong. Here's what Moses, as an example, was actually saying. So that's an important thing worth noting. All right, guys, let's go ahead and get into this episode of The Fog and the Whirlwind. All right, let's go ahead and hop into our first story, which has to do with the ICC. So let me begin actually a couple of years ago in 2023. So in March of 2023, the ICC issued an arrest warrant against President Vladimir Putin. Well, what does this have to do with right now? I'll get there. Just listen. He was accused of personal responsibility for the abductions of children in Ukraine and the illegal deportation of them. So I think the important thing to begin with in this episode is the reaction that conservatives had. That when by conservatives I mean just kind of the establishment against this happening. So what did they say? Just as an example, Ben Shapiro said, there's basically three stances that conservatives have. First stance is to just give a blank check to Ukraine, no restrictions, nothing. That's what the Biden administration is doing. The second is my position, which is to give aid to Ukraine, but to do so with strings attached. And then the third position is basically that Ukraine should be fully ruled by Russia, that Putin should take over the country and install a puppet dictatorship. I mean, he said that verbatim. I mean, that's exactly what Ben Shapiro said in this episode that I'm referring to. So that was the reaction to the ICC condemning Vladimir Putin, was a clapping, a round of applause. Yay, they're calling out Vladimir Putin. Well done. Well, so then what happens? So most recently, the ICC has condemned Bibi Netanyahu. And two things happened. First, Poland reached out and said, oh, Bibi Netanyahu, you can just come here. No big deal. Just come on over and we will protect you. So we have here, Poland says it will protect Benjamin Netanyahu from potential arrest. The Polish PM, Donald Tusk, says Israeli Prime Minister will not be detained despite ICC arrest warrant for Benjamin Netanyahu. The Polish government has adopted a resolution promising that senior Israeli officials, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, can freely travel to Poland for the 80th anniversary of the liberation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp later this month. He faces an arrest warrant issued by the International Criminal Court, the ICC, for alleged war crimes in Israel's war on Gaza. The Polish government treats the safe participation of the leaders of Israel in the commemorations of January the 27th, 2025 as part of paying tribute to the Jewish nation, millions of whose daughters and sons become victims of the Holocaust carried out by the Third Reich, read the resolution published by the office of Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk on Thursday. And then some of you may be thinking, okay, well, that's Poland. What did the United States do? The U.S. House of Representatives voted to sanction the ICC. I'm not kidding. U.S. House, this is from Reuters, U.S. House votes to sanction International Criminal Court over Israel. The U.S. House of Representatives voted on Thursday, so today is a Saturday, so this is a few days ago. This would have been the 9th, if memory serves, to sanction the International Criminal Court in protest at its arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his former defense minister over Israel's campaign in Gaza. The vote was 243 to 140 in favor of the illegitimate Court Counteraction Act, which would sanction any foreigner who investigates, arrests, detains, or prosecutes U.S. citizens or those of an allied country, including Israel, who are not members of the court. 45 Democrats joined 198 Republicans in backing the bill. No Republican voted against it. America is passing this law because a kangaroo court is seeking to arrest the prime minister of our great ally Israel. Representative Brian Mast, Republican chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, said in a House speech before the vote. Is Brian Mast the guy that said that there's no such thing as an innocent Palestinian? Maybe not. Maybe someone in the comments can educate me on that, but I think so. So that, notice the striking, the amazing difference between the ICC condemning Vladimir Putin, where it got widespread support in the United States, great job, to then the ICC condemns Netanyahu, and they get sanctioned by the United States House. Now, the Senate has not done that yet, but I'm sure it will. 243 to 140. I want to know who the 140 are, because the 140 actually give a crap about truth and give a crap about putting our country first. Israel, as I said before, is not an ally of our country in any meaningful way. They have dragged us into 6 conflicts. All you got to do is listen to the Jeffrey Sachs and Tucker Carlson interview. He names 7 countries that Israel has historically wanted us to go to war with. We have had conflicts with 6. A couple of hot wars, not all, but also drone strikes. And in the case of Libya, coups, CIA, intelligence, and military, like U.S. Navy SEAL, coups against that country. And the 7th one is Iran, and now, of course, the war drums are beating for war with Iran. All you got to do is look at Nikki Haley's or Lindsey Graham's Twitter accounts, because these people don't give a crap about putting our country first, our interests first. They want war, and that was one thing that I don't like Vivek anymore. But one thing that Vivek called out properly was he said Lockheed Martin and Raytheon have been paying Nikki Haley, and she got really mad about it because he called out the truth. He was correct, and she was angry about it. But these people want war with Iran, and for years Israel has as well. So they do not have our interests at heart. But then again, no one really does, except for a few people in the United States Congress that actually give a crap about our interests. The other thing that's worth noting is that the U.S. House voted on this, and they're a new Congress as of January, right? This is a new Congress. They could have voted for something about inflation, something having to do with mortgage prices being out of control, something to do with rent prices being out of control, anything having to do with de-escalating these wars. But instead they decided to vote on this. It was for some reason just too important for them to overlook. It's kind of telling, isn't it? Why is that the priority? Why is it not actually putting forward an America First agenda? And I'm tired of seeing so many people that call themselves America First, like this Bachal al-Sargon, I think is her name. She's been on, I previously was talking very positively about Bannon. I like Bannon, but he had her on. She's a hack for the establishment. She's also debated against Cenk Uygur and Dave Smith took a torch to her argument. Dave Smith was the best person in that debate, hosted by Sagar and Jetty. But this is why we want to show this. We want these people out of our movement. We want the neocons running from us in terror because we're sick of them. We are going to fight to take back our party, and we want America's interest to be put first. We don't want this elite group trying to bring us into another war over oil. We need to drill our own oil hill. And if we want to buy oil somewhere else, buy oil and bring it here, then we can if we trade for it. We need to have the Jeffersonian principles of peace, commerce, and trade with all nations, entangling alliances with none. The neocon view demands that George Bush and Dick Cheney and George Bush Sr. and John Bolton and, what's the idiot's name? Bill Kristol are a whole lot smarter than George Washington, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. No, actually, Pat Buchanan is echoing the founding fathers when he talks about putting our country first and stopping the wars. And that's what I stand for. I don't want to just get into one more war. I want to put our interests first. I want to put a megaphone in front of the American sovereignty movement, which a lot of the so-called America Firsters are part of that movement. They want American sovereignty. They want us to be independent. And I agree with that 100%. Let's do it for sure. So that was just an interesting thing to point out, the hypocrisy among the neocons of how they responded to one versus the other. There's no logical consistency. Okay, other thing worth talking about, and I think this is an important thing to cover, is the problem of credit card debt in our country. There is over $1 trillion of credit card debt total. So that's, when you've got to look at the average amount of credit card debt, which is, it's I think $50,000 or more right now. The average American household is in $50,000 of credit card debt. But then there's people who are in $100,000 or people that are in $5,000 of credit card debt. So when you look at the total across the United States, it is $1.166 trillion of credit card debt. Now, why is this relevant? Well, recently, Josh Hawley, who I like, and John Kennedy, who I also like, in the Senate, had a number of big execs in the Senate, in a committee, grilling them on, why are you guys making billions and trillions of dollars off of people with high interest rates and with exploiting people this way? Now, I am going to, unfortunately, not line up the way you probably want me to. I'm not going to come here and say we need to have legislation taking these people on. I think we probably do, but I will say the jury, for me, is still out on that. I want to think about that more. And here's why. Being in debt makes you a slave. The borrower is slave to the lender. I don't really give a crap if someone wants to just go into debt and say, well, I'll pay it back later and be ignorant and stupid. To me, that's, the natural consequences of your own actions. You're an adult. You can get into your own trouble if you want to. So that's something that's worth noting. The thing is, smart people, or people that are educated, even people that are not very smart, have a low IQ, but listen to people smarter than them, will listen to intelligent people talk about how these interest rates are just so high, and they're going to work to get out of debt. And that's a good thing. That's what we need. And see, when people are able to look at, well, I'm not going to get a credit card because the interest rates are too high, that can be kind of like a low IQ way of saying to yourself, I don't want to get into this kind of credit card debt. And that's a good thing, though. People need to avoid credit cards because of these high interest rates, because it makes you a slave. You just physically feel bad when you're in a ton of debt and you do whatever you want to do. You got to do to get out of the debt. So that's what you got to do. That's what we need in this country. So I'm kind of, in other ways, willing to let natural consequences prevail, if that makes sense. In other words, if someone wants to go into a ton of debt and feel really bad, that's kind of on them. You're an adult. If you want to stay out of debt, which is what I recommend, then great. I really don't care about, holding the credit card companies accountable, because people need to use them less and less. Now, what I think you should do, if you want financial advice from me, this is what I do, is I use a credit card for gas. Now, why do I have a credit card at all? Because it's important to build credit, especially when you're wanting to get a house or something. You need to have some kind of a history. People need to be able to look at, okay, well, yeah, you've been paying down your credit and you've been good. If you have no credit history, it's actually pretty hard. You're in a difficult situation. You can do what Dave Ramsey recommends, which is do manual underwriting. I'm a big fan of Dave Ramsey, but I would argue that it's more important to instead be very disciplined, and just pay for your gasoline, maybe groceries, and be extremely disciplined. Don't go out to eat all the time using a credit card. Don't go on vacations and use a credit card, but on limited things, little things, especially like gas in the car that you're going to pay for anyway, and then pay it off at the end of every month. That way, there's some kind of a history that the banks will be looking at, and your mortgage lender, as an example, whenever you get a house, because you need to be able to get a house one day. That's very important for you to be able to get a house. And it's harder, not impossible, but harder with no credit card history. So that would be my advice to you, is that you should do some, but you need to be very, very careful. And it's fraught with danger. And sorry, I got light in my eye. It's fraught with danger. That's something that Dave Ramsey is correct about, is that the credit card industry is very corrupt. That's something Tucker Carlson has talked about. I wouldn't mind seeing someone like the government beat up on the credit card companies because they're scum, and I get that. But at the same time, and again, like maybe for an example, banning their advertisements off the TV. If someone does that, I don't really give a crap. I'm not a libertarian. I'm not going to say, well, the free market just needs to take care of it. No, I'm not going to say that. But at the same time, it's not a priority for me. I think it's, in many ways, going over your limit on your credit card is an IQ test. You just need to be more disciplined. And these resources are available. You can go and watch for free or listen for free to the Dave Ramsey show and figure out how to get out of debt. And I'll have a heart for people. I want people to get better and get out of this, but I'm not too passionate about, taking the credit card company's task. What gets more complicated is the issue I'm going to be talking to you about now. So something, and this is a graph that I've got loading. It's going to be actually pretty hard to see, and I don't have a way of zooming in on it very much. But look at this. For those of you watching, if you're listening on audio, I'll kind of describe it. So this goes all the way back to the 1950s. It was 1960s, the first year, then 1965. No, I'm sorry, I'm reading that wrong. This is really hard to see. So it looks like 1980, 85, 90. Here we go. That's how it begins. Wages went down from the year 1980, started to go up in 85. 1990, they kind of stagnated a little bit. They would go up and down a little bit. But then all of a sudden, Trump gets into office. They started rising overall, but then they would go down at moments. But then from about 2015 to 2020, it's a pretty steep climb up. 2020 was sort of where it peaked. Then it fell back down, and now it's starting to rise again. Now, I read you guys another article, and that's just a graph for me to show you guys. I read you guys another article last week, a Saturday ago, where I talked to you guys about inflation and wages, and that wages are so low. They're growing at about 0.84. So that's not even 1% growth. That wages are really slowly growing. They're stagnant. I mean, 1% wage growth is not wage growth. That's basically stagnation. It's going up a little bit, and it's one's better than 0. 0.84 is better than 0. But it's not going up enough to go against inflation. Inflation is still out of control. It's still bad, and Trump hasn't even gotten to office yet. But he will then try and fix the issues with inflation. Probably going to have to talk to the Federal Reserve and stuff like that. So I think the point of what I'm saying is that we need something done about that. Now, and here's what I talked about last episode. So I talked about Pat Buchanan, and he is right, and anyone else is right. Stefan Molyneux also talks about this when they talk about birth rates in the West not being high enough. So to this, again, I think I said this last episode. Give me 1 minute. Sorry for the sound in the background. That I had a teacher at church that one time said, and this was back in the 20 teens, like probably 2010 roughly when I heard this. almost exactly right, probably 2009, 2010, was told by my Sunday school teacher, he's a math guy, brilliant math teacher, that the average at the time for children was for most middle class people to have 3.4 children. That number has gone down to 1.9. And I believe it. There's a ton of people I know that only have 2 kids. And so the number has gone down. And a lot of people like to point out, well, there are several social issues, and they're right when they bring it up. For example, they'll say, well, part of it's abortion, and part of it is the breakdown of the family, the breakdown of Christian values. Part of this is, whenever you turn on stuff from Hollywood, it's just trash about hooking up and not taking accountability, not raising a family. And you look at these people and you say to them, okay, you're right. Yeah, I talk all the time about culture, how important Christian values are. I literally have an outline saying we are going to turn the Republican Party into the Christian Values Party. I talk about this regularly, how important it is to become the Christian Values Party. I definitely want that, and I'm going to bring that back up for you guys for your viewing pleasure. So I want to turn the Republican Party into the Christian Values Party, and I want there to be Christian values in this country. I absolutely do. But then I think we should also have enough intellectual curiosity to say to ourselves, is it possible that there are more reasons beyond just the breakdown of the culture? And I said this to you last episode. I'm just kind of reconfirming that I'll be talking this year about economic issues as well. It's not only going to be cultural. Now, I was kind of being hyperbolic when I said it's going to be 50-50, 50% economic, 50% cultural. Not 100% true. I'm going to just try and make it more even to close. I'm going to try and get close, but I'm sure there's going to be times where it feels like, man, he's talking about culture a lot, and times where I talk, man, he's talking a lot about economics. Well, these things are important, and I think it's important to also consider, this is also something I brought up, that one of the reasons people are having less kids is because of the fact that they just can't daggum afford it. Like, for example, they're thinking about having another kid, they're barely paying their bills with 2 kids or with 1 kid, and say to themselves, well, because I literally have heard people say this, well, if we have another kid, let's say the mom is working, that mom's whole income is going to go to childcare, so she may as well just stay home with the children. Now, on the one hand, you could say, okay, good, stay home with the children. But that puts a ton of pressure on the man who's making $30,000 or $40,000, maybe even $50,000 a year, having to feed himself, his wife, 3 kids, pay for a mortgage. He's not just feeding them, but also paying for a place to live. If he's paying rent, that money is going into a hole never to be seen again. It's going into a mortgage, it's probably a $2,000 mortgage. In some places in New York, it's $4,000. It's insane. In other states like that. And so they just freaking can't afford it. So they're having less kids because they just can't afford it. How much of it is that a component? Because I want you guys to think about this. And this is a thread that I'm going to pull on this year. I will just tell you guys, I will be pulling on this thread. Back in the 50s and 60s, there was an interesting thing going on with American tax rates. Now, I'm going to pull up a study that I actually have pulled up that looks at the different tax rates. There's been corporate tax rates changes and then other economic growth. And this is from the 1940s. I'm going to read that to you guys. And then there's also another one that looks at things over just the history of our country. So something that was interesting, there's been arguments that the corporate tax rate is uniquely burdensome to U.S. business when compared with the corporate tax rates of its industrial peers. While the U.S. has one of the highest statutory corporate income tax among advanced countries, the effective corporate income tax rate, which is 27.7%, is quite close to the average of rich countries, 27.2%, weighed by GDP. It's also not high by historic standards. The statutory corporate tax has gradually been reduced from over 50% in the 1950s to its current 35%. So on paper, this is an important thing to note, on paper, we have a tax rate of 35%, but in reality, it's more like 27%. I'm going to put up a screenshot of this so you guys can see what I'm reading. That's an important thing that I want you guys to be able to look at with me and look at later for yourself. Sorry, I'm trying to get the visual aid to work. But yeah, I wanted to talk about this because I've heard this brought up by people that are very different from me and who I do not consider brothers in arms, who I do not consider a friend or an ally politically because they're too far left. Some of them even tiptoe in more like communist waters, and I am not ever going to be a Bolshevik or a communist. I can tell you that, guys, really, really clearly. So I'm going to put this screenshot up so you guys can find this article for yourselves because it's fascinating. Here we go. It is loading. So yeah, it's from the EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, and yeah, this tax rate used to be in the 50s, over 50%, and so the government was funded, and the majority of the taxes. So here you go. For those of you who want to look this up later, Economic Policy Institute, Corporate Tax Rates and Economic Growth since 1947 by Thomas L. Hungerford. So definitely look into that. Now those numbers are probably old. This is an old article, but the historical point still stands that the corporate tax used to be a lot higher, and it's not anymore. And a lot of people will say, well, if you cut prices on corporations, they're more likely to do things like hiring people. Sometimes, yeah, and then sometimes they actually don't hire more American workers. They do things like what Elon Musk wants to do, and Vivek Ramaswamy, and bring in people from India and do H-1B jobs. And that's a major issue that I have a problem with. So we need to do a couple of things. We need to make sure we're thinking about the American worker when it comes to not replacing them, not bringing in people to take their jobs. That's very important. But then the other thing we got to think about is, why are their wages not going up high enough? And I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, it's 100% greed, but some of it has to be. Some of it has to be that these people need to pay their workers more. And part of the reason why they're not is because they don't have to, in the sense that they can hire, for example, if they're, have a call center, they can just say, well, we're just going to outsource the call center over to India, rather than having to hire people here and pay them at least our minimum wage. And here's the other thing about the minimum wage that's complicated, is a lot of people just say, well, we shouldn't raise the minimum wage. It should be $0.00. That's what more of the libertarian type people believe. And I'm not a libertarian. I think that we definitely should have a minimum wage. And I would argue that it needs to go up, but very little. So should it be 15? I think it needs to go up with inflation. I think that's what the minimum wage should do. Now, it may be maybe a little bit less than inflation, but I think it should go up incrementally with inflation. So when was the minimum wage instituted at $7.25? It had been that for a while when I first got into the workforce, and that was in 2015. So now we're in 2025, 10 years later. Why has the minimum wage federally not gone up at all when we've had so much of a raise in inflation? Now, some people will say, well, we don't want, to do that because it'll hurt small businesses. Completely understand and agree with that. The small businesses are the backbone of our economy. We don't want to do anything to hurt them. So make this the rule, that this new minimum wage, let's just say whatever it is, let's just say $10 or $8 or something, should only apply to companies that have employees of, let's just say 500 or more employees. That, I think, is a reasonable ask. And it's because there are people in this country who work at Dollar General, work at McDonald's, wherever they work, and then they go home and they're trying to pay their bills and they can't. They have to go into debt. They feel like they have to go into debt. Now, some people in America have an out-of-control spending problem. They get out of work and then they go to QT and buy food when they should go down to Walmart or somewhere and get cheap food that they can cook for themselves, beans and rice if you got to feed your children and feed yourself. So there are people that are out of control spenders. They've got 1,000 subscriptions, like, oh, we got to subscribe to this guy on YouTube and we got to subscribe to this channel over here. I'm talking about paid subscriptions. Netflix and Hulu or Disney Plus's bundle or on Spotify, and they just have everything, Crunchyroll, you name it. They've got all these things. They got an out of control spending problem, and they're driving everywhere, going to the beach every few weeks, something crazy like that. There are people that are just out of control spenders. There are. But there are people who are not spending like crazy. They're just trying to play by the rules and get by, and they can't because they're not getting paid enough at work. And in this situation, I don't think it's right or just or okay to either be envious and jealous of the billionaires, which is where a lot of leftists go wrong. They're like, we need to take their money, seize their assets, and distribute it to the proletariat. 100% opposed to that. That's wrong. We need elites. We need rich people in this country. I am a right-wing elitist. I'm not a populist. I'm a right-wing elitist. I think there should be rich people in this country. And I think two things can be true at the same time. And I want them to make a lot of money. I want them to be well paid. I think they deserve it. If they deserve it, then they should get paid a lot. But also, and two things can be true at once, I want people to be able to afford being able to live in this country. Now, it should not be mandated by government force too much. I think that, again, a tiptoeing of the raising of the minimum wage is called for. If you want to make your case to me why it should be higher, then I'll listen with open ears. But that's an important thing worth discussing and worth talking about. I'm sorry for any background noise. But yeah, I wanted to come to you guys and talk to you about populism. This is part of the title of this episode. Is populism bad? Well, I would argue that it's not bad per se. but that it can go out of control. So the reason I call myself a right-wing elitist is because I am hierarchical. So a big difference between, for example, and I had a chart for a while. Let me try and write a chart. It was like a political compass almost of the differences between the right and the left. So let me try and pull it up for you guys and show you. But I was talking to American Neo-Reactionary, and we were talking about the differences between different members of the dissident right. And then we also started talking about just the right and left in general. And Curtis Yarvin has made this point, and so has Pete Quinones, that a big difference between the left and the right is, do you believe in hierarchy or not? So here you have on the left of this chart that I'm showing right now, communism. And I would probably put populism in the middle. Populism is kind of centrist. And I'm not a centrist, which is why I wouldn't call myself a populist. I'm also, though, not toward the very top where I'm more of like a libertarian. I wouldn't call myself that either. I would tend to be kind of toward the right side, kind of the middle right between individualism and absolutism. I tend to be more like a nationalist. You can see nationalism listed there. But I do tend towards more like Tsarism and things like that because I am very hierarchical. I think it is very important in any culture, any society, to have hierarchy. There are these people here who make the decisions. They decide the direction things go. The problem in America right now is not that we have elites. It's not. That's part of the problem with populism. A lot of populism are like, well, the elites are evil. They are bad. We don't need to have elites. And that's the problem I have with some populists who are like, there should be no billionaires in our country. 100% disagree with that. If you are doing things morally, playing by the rules, and paying people well, then you should be able to make billions of dollars. I will say that. I think that you should. But what you shouldn't be able to do is screw people over, which is why we need, for example, big changes on policy on pharmaceuticals with all these horrible side effects on what they do to people, the horrible food that people are giving out to people, junk food. I do think there should be some food that is banned from our country. It's banned from European countries. Certain things like even Doritos are really bad for us. We don't need to be unhealthy in this country. There needs to be certain things that we do look out for our fellow man about. And I think the elites need to do that. We need to have good elites that actually give a crap about other people besides themselves. And so, in certain ways, we can't be their daddy. If we can't just say, oh, again, I just said a bit ago that I'm fine with certain things with credit card rates, but I'm not okay with drugs. I think we need to look out for people and not have drugs just be made illegal and say, well, we just can't do anything. I'm a little bit more, I guess, hands off when it comes to credit cards than I am with other stuff. And we can, go into that perhaps in future episodes. But the important thing to note is that if you get far to the left, there is no hierarchy there. I showed the political compass for a second there, but whenever you're on the right, there is a hierarchy, and we need a hierarchy. So I'm not a populist. And part of the reason is, historically, when you look at populism, it looks a lot like the French Revolution. It looks a lot like the people saying, guillotine them all, the rich are bad, the rich are evil, we don't need aristocrats, we're all just part of the French Republic. Well, it didn't end up going very well, did it? They got Napoleon, which, Napoleon actually had some interesting and cool things about him. But in other ways, he wasn't. He was a kind of a strong man that came out of a very chaotic time period, which is what people do, by the way. In a chaotic time period, they turn to someone for order. To continue, the other reason that I'm not an elitist is because a lot of these people like Cenk Uygur and Anna Kasparian and Kyle Kulinski, who are more like a left populist. Cenk calls himself a democratic capitalist, so I don't want to put words in his mouth. He may not consider himself a populist. He calls himself a democratic capitalist. I know that Kyle Kulinski calls himself a populist or like a left populist. He calls himself like a left populist, and I think a social democrat. Is the thing about these guys, they say, well, just look at the polls and do what's popular, dude. They basically, I actually was like making memes about it with Kyle Kulinski because he constantly talks about how his views are popular. I don't really give a crap if my views are popular. I want them to be correct. I want them to be right. I want them to be historical and intelligent. And for example, do you really want to poll the American people and ask them, do you think people should be required to get the COVID vaccine? And do you want to just go along with that and say, well, the government is listening to the people. They want the COVID vaccine to be mandatory, so therefore we're going to make it mandatory. There's a lot of irrational stuff. And when you listen to Scott Adams, by the way, he's someone that really talks about just the irrationality of people, of human beings, that don't really think about their political positions, especially about politics, but also other things. We've got real problems with thinking rationally in this country. We're not really taught how to think. In school, we're taught what to think. And Brian Kaplan had a discussion with Dave Rubin that was interesting. I don't like Brian Kaplan's political beliefs. He's an anarchist, and I don't agree with any of that. but he did have a book that was anti-democracy that was really good, called The Myth of the Rational Voter. And he talks about how little people remember from school, just in terms of how the government functions and stuff like that. And the idea that we have a democracy where everyone can vote on this stuff is actually very troubling. And then the other problem you have with going full populist is you eventually start taking people's wealth, and then they say to themselves, well, if you're going to take my money, then I'm not going to live in the US. I'm going to move to Switzerland. I'm going to move to Hong Kong. And then you have no rich people in America, and then it stinks. Because we know that from looking at historically what other countries have done. I mean, look at the situation in Venezuela, which probably began as a very populist movement, but went too far. And that's the point. I think that there are certain things we can do with populism. It can be used as a tool, for example, to get rid of the bad elites. But the goal should always be to get good elites in. This is why I don't identify myself as a populist, but a right-wing elitist. I want the right kind of people in power. And by the way, what does it look like when you have the right people in power? It looks like the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers, who had their problems. Teddy Roosevelt needed to go against them on certain issues, but they also built beautiful churches in our country, built infrastructure in our country, and did a lot of philanthropic work. And there's also a lot of rich people right now who do wonderful philanthropic work. I've been hugely critical of Elon Musk about his statements on immigration, but one thing that he did, sorry, I got a little bit of light. One thing that he did that was awesome was he came to North Carolina, and he came through for us. We had problems in Helene, and even in South Carolina, there were problems with Helene, damage done. And did Elon just sit on his hands and say, not my problem? No, he came down here, did things with Starlink. He and Trump and Dr. Phil came down here and helped the other volunteers. There's also other wonderful volunteers helping out in this situation. Can't find a happy medium. It's either too bright or not bright enough. Excuse me while I adjust the light a little bit. But yeah, that's an important thing to remember, worth noting, is that rich people can also do wonderful things. This is a really good thing to help convince you too. Watch the show Undercover Boss and look at how wonderfully generous some of these CEOs are. They find out, there was one I watched, there was a guy that found out that his employee was homeless, was at a homeless shelter with her son. He reached into his pocket and paid for her to get a house. It was over 200 grand. He was a wonderfully generous guy. And there's multiple other stories like this. Other people with just crazy generosity. Some of the crazy stuff they've done, like Dave Ramsey at his company. I mean, there was a lady that had cancer. She didn't work for 2 years and she still got paid. So there are examples of rich people that are wonderful people. And we should have an economy where the evil rich people have strict penalties, and it ends up impacting them financially, and then they need to do the right thing. And then the good rich people, really just what we need in our economy, make all kinds of money, billions of dollars for all I care. I want a hierarchical economy, a hierarchical government, but I also want people, the common man, to get their money. I want them to be able to get paid and to be able to have a lot of kids. I want you to be able to climb up. You need a world, we don't need a utopia. That's part of the problem. Right-wingers also don't believe in utopia. We believe in heaven. We know that that's the utopia one day we're going to go to. But this side of Eden, there is not going to be a utopia. And we kind of get that here on the right, especially the dissident right. The left wants to turn everything into utopia now. And we understand that's not going to happen. But what we can do is make a world that makes sense, where you play by the rules and you can have a family. And right now the problem is right now it's increasingly hard to. And there are certain things we can tweak, certain things we can do to make the system more fair. So that's something I wanted to talk to you about. I think we're going to close out the show talking about culture a little bit more. So something that I saw, there's been a state, so for a while, North Carolina, well, they still do. So North Carolina put in a law saying that Pornhub was going to have to age verify everyone that used the app. And interestingly, Pornhub then removed the app in North Carolina, which makes you wonder to yourself, why are these people pushing porn on our children? Why is it that there is this elite group that is funding Pornhub, and including men that, and again, it's predominantly men, but there's women too, who use Pornhub and pay them? Why are these people taking this money and using it to push porn on children? Because it would logically follow, well, if there's an age verification law in North Carolina, Pornhub should just follow the law. But they didn't. They then took down the app in North Carolina. And that's interesting. That's troubling. There's also a map, and I don't have it in front of me, but I'm going to try and pull it up and put it in front of you, because there's 16 states that have restricted Pornhub, and that's awesome. I just can't get enough of it. I think this is amazing that these states are using government to do what is right, and we need this very badly. We need this to happen, and so I'm going to show you the map showing what states have done this because it's important for you guys to know. But all they're doing, guys, it's not even that they're doing that much. They're just doing something very basic, which is saying if you're underage, you can't use it. And the funny thing is, what has happened is that the site has had problems. The site will crash or will be off the store. And again, this just comes back to it. Why are these people so daggum intent on publicizing this crap for young people? Because there seems to be a satanic agenda happening here. And I really believe that communism, progressivism, and I think you can even argue other things as well, are satanic. And pornography definitely is. I mean, when you look at all it is worship of self. All it is how can I have pleasure right now? And this is something I was talking about with our culture earlier, why people are having less kids. I genuinely believe that some of it is that people just sit at the comfort of their home and they don't go out and meet people. Why? Because they can just sit at home and basically look at bad stuff. All right, I am trying to get the map up so you guys can look at it. But yeah, these are the states that have actually taken steps to restrict the site. They haven't banned it outright. But here's the way that I see this. And I'm pulling up the map right now. So here's the states you can see. So I'm going to read the list out loud to you guys who are listening on audio. The states that have passed or agreed to pass age restriction laws are Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Idaho, Indiana, Kansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Montana, Nebraska, North Carolina, Oklahoma, Texas, Utah, and Virginia. So 16 states, and soon to be, I hope, God willing, South Carolina. Now here's the way that I see it, is we actually need to take things even further. I am not a libertarian. I do not believe in drug legalization. I do not believe that people should say to themselves, well, if people are going to do weed or crack or regular cocaine or methamphetamines, they're going to get them anyway, and criminalizing it makes it worse. So we should just, let them have free, basically turn the country into Oregon, where they can just do drugs, psychedelics, do everything, do shrooms, whatever they want. I don't agree with that at all. I think that this is the stated purpose I see for government. It's in Romans 13. And there's a passage that's very important about submitting to authority. But there's also a part that Paul's talking about where he says, what is the role of government? It is to punish evil and to reward good. And that's very important. We are to reward good, punish evil. And when someone is, drinking to excess, when someone is doing crack or just regular cocaine or is a porn addict, there should be repercussions, consequences for that kind of behavior. And I am for the banning of pornography nationwide. We need to have a legislative agenda. And it's very clear that porn is a drug. You can look at sources from Fight the New Drug, which talks about pornography and the negative effects it has on the brain, but also the negative effects it has on marriages and on the family. And it's very important that we fight this battle. And what I want is this to be a domino. I want the first domino to fall to be age restriction, which, by the way, is also having Pornhub, especially, take stuff down, which is good. Having app issues, which is a good thing. That's just one domino. The next domino that needs to happen, and needs to happen yesterday, is to ban all of it completely. We need that to happen. There's been people that have signed petitions and things like that, but we need more to happen here. So that's an important thing. There's been some victories here, but they're small ones, and we need some big ones. And a big one would be for a state government to just outright ban it. Ban OnlyFans, ban Pornhub, and restrict other graphic content, especially for minors, but for other people in general as well. We need that. We need Christian values. But that's on the legislative end. On the non-legislative end, we need revival in our country, because the way for this to stick, the way for this to actually stay, because otherwise people are going to just get into office and say, well, we're going to have a non-legislative agenda here. We're just going to re-legalize it. The way for that to not happen is to have a spiritual change in our country, a change where people say to themselves, you know what, this stuff is actually messed up and we don't want it in our culture. And if you're Christians, predominantly Christians, it's not going to happen. You're going to keep these laws on the books that are restricting this kind of crap. And that's what we need. So we need a revival in our country. And I want to challenge you, and I'm challenging myself too when I say it. What are you doing to spread the gospel? What are you doing to obey what Christ has commanded, which is to go forward and preach the gospel to all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit? Because if we do that, if we do what we are commanded to do in the Great Commission, then a lot of these problems are going to take care of themselves: alcoholism, drug use, and porn. These things will go away. They will be restricted. They will at least be on the fringe of society. And that's another thing we need to do. We need to stigmatize alcoholism a little bit more. We need to stigmatize smoking a little bit more. We need to stigmatize drug use and being a porn addict way more, because these things cannot be socially acceptable. They are not. So that's an important thing to remember on the culture war side. So to go on to the last segment of the show, and it's funny because I thought this was going to be shorter. It ended up being almost as long as the initial episode where I had technical problems. We're going to now talk about something that's been on my mind a little bit, which is a lot of young people. So, for example, there's a guy named Brendan Robinson, I think his name is either Robinson or Robertson, who's a so-called gay pastor. There's also tons of, there's a gay guy that looks like a priest. He's probably Anglican or Methodist, Methodist pastor or Anglican priest, who wears a rainbow all the time to show he's got solidarity with the LGBT. So there's that guy who's on TikTok. And there's also just been a ton of videos of women getting up, especially in Methodist churches, and preaching about God being trans, God being okay with gay marriage and things like that. That's Brendan Robinson's whole shtick. He also had a video where he said Jesus was racist. So this guy's completely out of his mind. But the good thing is, there's to his credit, I really like this guy, a Christian conservative type who interviewed him, and all he really did was ask him questions. He didn't really push back all that hard, but he asked a lot of very telling questions, because it became very clear Brendan Robinson is not even a Christian in name. He says he is, and of course he's not a Christian, but he says he is in name, and he's not, because he does not believe that Jesus was sinless, as he believed Jesus sinned while on this planet. He also believes that the Bible is not completely, not only inerrant, but infallible. He believes that there are errors in the Bible. So he's not even a Christian in name, let alone in practice. I mean, he is a fallen human being who I hope finds Jesus. And so, but the problem is, this is the problem that I wanted to get into. A lot of young men see stuff like this, see crap like this, and they say, you know what, this whole Protestantism thing is wrong. Basically, they look at the Reformation and say, the Reformation should never have happened. And they decide to go back to Rome. They decide to go back to the Roman Catholic Church. And some of them decide to go to the Eastern Orthodox Church. And I want to make two things very clear. Sorry, I'm getting thirsty. Two things very clear. I am always going to tell you, when it comes to any faith, being a Christian, you need to read up on the church fathers. I need to read up more on the church fathers. I've got an entire bookshelf sitting here underneath the Return and the Annals of the Stupid Party and the Revolution. I've got a whole shelf of church history that I'm going to be reading. And that's one problem with Protestants. A lot of Protestants don't know very much about church history. So young men, especially, because a lot of young men are talking like this and saying, we need to go back to being Catholic, or we need to go back to being Eastern Orthodox. Read church history, or even if you're a Protestant who's questioning things, or just a Protestant in general, any Christian, read the church fathers. Go back to the early church with Jesus and his apostles, and then come forward to the modern day. Read, read, read. It may sound overwhelming, but turn on an audiobook. And I have things I can recommend you. There's a book by a guy named Gonzalez called An Essential Guide to Church History. There's a book written by David F. Wells called Reformed Theology in America. I'm going to recommend to you too Albion's Seed. Oh man, what's the name of that one? Hackett Fisher, I believe, is the author. Albion's Seed, that talks about the history of Protestantism and just Christianity in general in our country. But it also looks more at like the immigrants coming to America, the American frontier from England and Scotland and Ireland. But the big thing that you walk away with that book is how important Christian Protestantism is to this American culture. The other thing you can read, I would encourage you to read The Confessions and City of God by Augustine. You should definitely read that. Ruth A. Tucker wrote a book called Parade of Faith, a biographical history of the Christian church. Inspiring Men of Faith. I've got a lot of stuff sitting here. Read about the saints as well. You should. I think it's important for you to read in church history. So do that. That's A. Now, once you have done that, once you have read the entire Bible and read also, I'm talking about the 66 books, and also read some church history, if you still feel in your soul that you want to read the Catholic Bible, which includes things like the Apocrypha and stuff like that. So I think 76 books. It's more books, I know for sure. And you also want to go to a parish. You also want to go to Mass, or you want to go to Divine Liturgy in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. If you feel like God is leading you that way, then I bless you. I mean, may God bless you, and I will pray for you. Not necessarily, oh, pray that He'll change His mind. No, but I'll pray for you that God will continue to reveal Himself to you in your church, in your Mass, or in your Divine Liturgy, if you're Orthodox, and that you will come to faith, that you will follow after Jesus in the way that He wants you to. So I am not going to sit here and say that you're a sinner. You can't go to the Catholic Church. If you do, you're a sinner, or to a liturgy and you're a sinner. No. What I will say is that there are certain things that the Catholic Church is not okay with me. There's the Council of Trent, which has not been rejected, which condemns most Protestants. It's pretty hardcore. Now, it's a little bit better in Roman, what's it called, Vatican II. Things are a little bit more embracing when it comes to Protestantism from the Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox. They don't have Vatican I or Vatican II, but they have other issues with Protestantism. And so, you may view me a certain way because your hierarchy of apostolic succession in your church, meaning for you, if you're EO, Eastern Orthodox, be your patriarchs may not like me, and they may lead to you not liking me, and that's okay. Or you, if you're Catholic, may not like me because the Pope tells you that Protestants have issues. And we can go back and forth on theology as long as we're reasonable and kind to each other and Christ-like. That's the important thing, to be Christ-like. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you you're going to hell, because there are wonderful people who are Catholics that I've met who are passionate about Jesus, and same for Eastern Orthodox that I've also interacted with, mainly online, less so in real life. But yeah, that's something that I will say. So it may be that you end up going that way toward the more, the older style of Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. Now, whenever I listen to Joshua Shuping talk to someone who's more like me, those two guys really are both like me. Joshua Shuping and Pastor Joel Webben in Texas are more like a Reformed Baptist. They're confessional 1689 particular or Reformed Baptist. And Joshua Shuping used to be pretty deep into the Eastern Orthodox Church. He was a priest, and he makes very clear that the Eastern Orthodox Church tries to say they have not changed for 2,000 years or 1,500 years, whatever it is, meaning whenever they formally started from their early church. And Joshua Shuping makes very clear that's not true. They have changed multiple times. And there's been times also that Joel Webben has preached and said there's also been many times the Catholic Church has changed. They'll try and say they have not, but Vatican I, Vatican II have changed things. And have Protestants changed over time? Yeah. In fact, I was listening to one gentleman speaking about why he left Protestantism. He was a Baptist, and he went to being Eastern Orthodox. And he talked about how there was really three reformations. One that was with Luther, that was not radical at all. The second one, which was a little bit stronger than the third one, which was very radical, which led to things like a lot of non-denominational stuff and even some Pentecostal stuff. And again, there's wonderful brothers and sisters who are non-denom and who are Pentecostal. I'm not. I'm not either non-denom or Pentecostal, and will not be. I am, I'm pretty solidly in that Reformed tradition. I lean more towards old church. I am looking into Lutheranism as well. That ties a lot into my Swedish blood. My big profile pictures pretty much everywhere are of Gustav Vasa I. He actually was Catholic, but then converted to Lutheranism. And pretty much from that time on, Sweden was Lutheran, majority Lutheran. It's now a mixture of Lutheran and atheist, unfortunately. But I pray for Sweden that Sweden will then turn back to Christianity, because there's a lot of things in Lutheranism that are beloved, that are wonderful, wonderful doctrine. Luther was a wonderful man. He was a very interesting person. He was also not radically against Rome. It was Rome that was radically against him. That's part of my problem with the Catholic Church is some of the history. There's a lot of spilled blood, and again, it's not that I hold a grudge, but it's that, just a matter of historical. Well, in the past, the Catholic Church has persecuted Protestants, burned them at the stake, killed them. Now, have there been atrocities on both sides? Yeah, if you look at the 30 Years' War, there was also slaughters where Protestant armies got out of control, where the officers couldn't control their men, and also times where the Catholic armies, they couldn't control their men. and people were slaughtered on both sides. I mean, I think it was 8 million people that died in Germany alone during the 30 Years' War. It was extremely bloody. I think the only war that really caught up with it was probably World War II. World War I might have been close, but yeah, there was millions of people dead in the 30 Years' War. It was a terribly brutal war that was done really on the basis of religious grounds. So I will encourage you guys to pray, to read the Bible, to read the early church, and I will also encourage you to go further than that and to follow Christ as well as you know how. And then to also be careful, because there's also passages in Romans about not passing judgment on your brothers, especially with what you may eat and the celebration of days. I try to apply that as a Protestant to our Catholic and Orthodox folks, our friends over there. Some of you are brothers and some of you aren't. Some of you, it's an outward expression. That's all it is. And then also people that are Protestant. Some of it is just an outward expression, and that's all it is. This needs to be done in the heart. And some of you, on the other side, are very much doing it in your heart. It's an act of worship for you. That's great. I will assure you that for me, in the Protestant church, that what I do is an act of worship to our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And so that's very important to remember on both ends, right? So, wanted to talk to you guys about that and how I feel about it. And I think there's to continue, a lot of it with young people is, again, this feeling of, well, these people haven't changed for a couple thousand years. And then the other thing they do is they'll try and look at the Catholic Church and say, well, it hasn't changed, and they'll try to ignore the current Pope. You shouldn't. But then some people will say, okay, the current Pope is bad, but well, I'm going to become Orthodox instead. Well, there's problems with that as well. Non-biblical things that they hold to as far as priests being able to forgive sins. It's actually interesting. So whenever it comes to confession, the Orthodox priests will say that they absolve the believer of their sins. The Catholic priest actually says no one can forgive sins but God alone. That's really good. That's much better. That's way closer to biblical truth on the Catholic side than the Protestant side, right? So that's just some lists of some problems I have with these groups as far as their doctrine, their teaching. But with the people, I'm not going to sit here and be unkind to you. But I think one thing that's a danger to young men as well is that they go to a modern service, and it's a bunch of electric guitars, a bunch of drums and things like that, and they can't connect with it very well. I would encourage you to go to a Lutheran church or a Presbyterian traditional service, because there's sometimes Presbyterian churches that are more modern. Find one that's more traditional and listen to that pipe organ and sing these songs and recite the Nicene Creed and the Apostolic Creed, the Apostles' Creed, and listen to the teaching there. And you will feel at home. You will feel that these songs you're singing, this doctrine is not all about, oh, my heart and how I feel. No, it's about truth, eternal truths. And a lot of them are written by Charles Wesley. And I mean, the song, things like And Can It Be and Oh, Arise, My Soul, Arise, will connect with your soul in a way that you will really enjoy and feel. A lot of these young men that are wanting to go for something a little bit older and deeper. The other thing you can do is go to so I mentioned Lutheran, Presbyterian. You can go to a Baptist church. You can go, there's a few conservative Southern Baptist Convention churches, but I'm going to encourage you to go to a confessional or a particular or Reformed Baptist church. And some of them sing with instruments, some don't. And listen to the preaching there. And also primitive Baptist churches. Because again, whenever you go to a conservative Lutheran church or conservative Presbyterian church traditional or conservative Baptist church, you will have the feeling of, okay, these are actually intellectually stimulating and spiritually stimulating. You need to have something engage you in all three: physical, emotional, intellectual, and spiritual. And so physical, emotional, intellectual, spiritual need to all be engaged in the service. Physical in the sense of the music going through your ears, right? I think that's important. And it can be the singing of voices, by the way. It can be a cappella, that's fine. Or it can be instruments as well. And then also emotionally, you need to have your emotions stirred as well. But then intellectual, you need a sermon that breaks into things and gives you meat, not just milk. And then spiritually, the most important, which is why you go to church, right? And these places, Reformed Baptist, Primitive Baptist, which are two different things, by the way, and then Lutheran and Presbyterian, to me, every time I've been in those churches, have engaged all of those things. And I have the least amount of experience with Lutheranism, which is why I want to look into it some. but I have more experience with Presbyterian. I grew up in the Presbyterian church, grew up in a church that after that was more Reformed Baptist, pretty much. It was non-denom, but very close to Reformed Baptist. I've written this on Substack, by the way. And then also I've been to Primitive Baptist churches and loved it, and been to other Presbyterian churches and loved it. So that's the important thing to consider, is that if you're going for an aesthetic, if it's the worship that is the problem, maybe the doctrine, but the worship's the problem in a Protestant church that you're going to, young guys that I'm talking to right now, don't give up on Protestantism. Don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Go to a church that does preach the deep things of the Lord and has a worship style that you appreciate more. Because what you'll feel as you sit in these services is you will feel, this is how our ancestors worshipped. And that's important to a lot of young men. They want to worship in a way that their ancestors worshipped. They need a feeling of identity, a feeling of belonging, even if they don't feel like they belong at like high school or secular humanism and other parts of society. They need to feel at home in church. And part of feeling at home in church can be the feeling of, I belong somewhere in history. And that's important. And also doing what you feel and you believe God commands you to do when it comes to worship. So that's an important thing worth remembering. I wanted to speak to you guys about that because that's important. There's a lot of young people that are struggling with that, and I wanted to speak to you. That's going to about do it, guys. I appreciate every single one of you listening to this episode of The Fog and the Whirlwind. So make sure you remember to subscribe here on YouTube, follow me on Rumble, follow me on X, and make sure you're following on Odyssey as well, and on Spotify if you're listening on Spotify or on Substack. Everybody, I'm looking forward to talking to you in episode 100. Have a great evening and take care. We're going to have our little political compass stuff.